He bought a widow and her 3 children for only a handful of silver, and by sunset, every person in the valley was laughing at him. They said Elias Harper had finally lost what little sense poverty had left him. They said a man who could barely feed himself had no business dragging 4 more starving souls into his ruined cabin at the edge of Black Pine Valley. Some even placed bets in the tavern that night, wagering on whether the widow, the children, or Elias himself would die first when winter came down from the mountains. But none of them knew the truth about the quiet woman standing beside him. None of them knew what her hands had once built, what her mind could see, or what she had hidden from the world for the sake of surviving one more day. The morning began with an auction bell ringing through the muddy town square, dull and joyless beneath a sky the color of wet ash. Farmers, merchants, debt collectors, and bored townspeople gathered in loose circles, not because they cared about justice, but because misery had always been cheap entertainment in that part of the country. Elias had come only to look at an old plow. He had 6 silver coins in his pocket, all the money he owned, and even those coins were supposed to buy nails for his leaking roof before the first snow. His cabin sat nearly 5 miles beyond the last fenced pasture, where the pines grew black and thick and the road became more stone than dirt. He lived there alone with 1 mule, 1 axe, 1 rusted stove, and a silence so deep that some nights it felt like another person sitting beside him. He had never married. Not because he hated women, as some people joked, and not because no woman would look at him, though plenty said that too. He had simply spent too many years trying not to starve. Love was a luxury. Family was a dream for men with warm barns, full cellars, and names people respected. Elias had none of those things. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered from labor, brown-haired, quiet-eyed, and poor enough that people spoke about him while he stood close enough to hear. He had learned long ago that anger wasted strength, and strength was something a poor man could not afford to waste. So he stood at the edge of the crowd and listened as wagons were sold, tools were sold, 2 thin cows were sold, a cracked butter churn was sold, and then, just as people began to drift away, the auctioneer cleared his throat and announced the final lot. 2 county men brought a woman onto the wooden platform. Behind her came 3 children. The woman wore a faded brown dress and a shawl patched at the elbows. She was not beautiful in the polished way rich men praised, but there was something about her that made the laughing men lower their voices. Her face was pale from hunger, her cheekbones sharp, her dark hair tied back without ribbon or vanity, and her eyes held a stillness that did not belong to defeat. The children stood close to her. The oldest was a boy of 10 with a split lip and fists clenched as though he expected the whole world to strike first. The second was a girl of 7, thin as a reed, with solemn eyes and 1 hand wrapped in her mother's skirt. The youngest, a little boy not yet 5, hid half his face against the woman's leg and stared out at the crowd as if every boot in the square belonged to a monster. The auctioneer unfolded a paper and read in a bored voice, "Martha Rowan, widow of Thomas Rowan, deceased. 3 dependent children. Debt attached to leased property. Buyer assumes responsibility for county balance and household charge." A murmur moved through the crowd. Someone spat into the mud. Someone laughed and said, "So now we sell hunger by the bundle." Another answered, "No, we sell trouble before it becomes the town's trouble." Martha did not flinch. She did not beg. She did not raise her voice. That was what struck Elias first. A desperate person would have pleaded. A broken person would have wept. But this woman stood as if some invisible beam inside her spine refused to bend, even when the world tied a price to her name. "Opening bid," the auctioneer called. 5 silver. Silence. The wind pushed a scrap of paper across the boards. 5 silver, he repeated. No one moved. A round-faced farmer near the front folded his arms. 3 children? You'd have to pay me to take them. A woman whispered, "Poor things." But she did not lift her hand. 4 silver, the auctioneer said. Still nothing. The oldest boy's jaw tightened. The little girl looked at her mother, waiting for fear to appear there, but Martha kept her face calm. 3 silver, the auctioneer said, irritation creeping into his voice. County wants them placed today. Send them to the orphan house, someone called. Full, said another. Then send them to the mill. Mill won't take the little ones. Laughter scattered across the square, thin and cruel. Elias felt his hand close around the coins in his pocket. 6 silver, roof nails, salt, flour, maybe a little lamp oil if he bargained hard. Winter was coming early. Everyone could feel it. The geese had flown south before the leaves fully turned, and the old trappers said that meant deep snow. He had no room for pity. Pity would not patch his roof. Pity would not fill his cellar. Pity would not keep a mule alive through February. 2 silver, the auctioneer said, now almost embarrassed. The crowd laughed louder. I give 1, a drunk near the tavern shouted, if the widow can chop wood. Martha's eyes moved toward him, just once, and though she said nothing, the drunk stopped smiling. Elias looked at the children again. The small boy's shoes were tied with twine. The girl had no stockings. The older boy was trying so hard not to tremble that his whole body had gone stiff. Something inside Elias remembered standing at a grave at 13 years old, while adults discussed where he could be sent, who might take him, what his labor was worth, whether feeding him would cost more than he could repay. He remembered being spoken of like a broken tool. He remembered deciding that if he survived, he would never become the sort of man who could watch a child measured in coins and call it business. 5 silver, Elias said. His own voice surprised him. So did the silence that followed. Heads turned. The auctioneer blinked. Martha looked directly at him. The farmer near the front burst out laughing. Elias Harper? You? Another man slapped his knee. Lord help us, the beggar bought a beggar bride. He'll bring them home and eat pine bark together. No, said someone else. They'll freeze before they get hungry. The auctioneer lifted his hammer quickly, as if afraid Elias might come to his senses. 5 silver offered. Any higher? Nobody answered. 5 silver once. The crowd grinned. 5 silver twice. Elias pulled the coins from his pocket and felt the cold weight of them against his palm one last time. Sold. The hammer struck the block, and with that sound, the valley gave Martha Rowan and her children away for less than the price of a healthy goat. Elias walked to the platform and placed 5 coins in the auctioneer's hand. 1 silver remained in his pocket. 1 silver between 5 people and winter. The auctioneer shoved a paper at him. Sign here. Elias made his mark. Martha stepped down from the platform. Up close, he saw that exhaustion had made shadows under her eyes, but her gaze was steady. I cannot promise comfort, he said quietly. I know, she replied. Her voice was low, roughened by hunger or cold, but calm. I cannot promise much food either. I know that too. He glanced at the children. I won't hurt them. For the first time, something moved across her face. Not softness exactly, not trust, but the faintest crack in the wall she had built around herself. Then you have already promised more than most men. Elias did not know what to say to that, so he picked up the small bundle at her feet, turned toward the mountain road, and began walking. The crowd followed them with jokes until the town square disappeared behind the slope. The youngest child stumbled before they reached the first bend. Elias stopped, crouched, and looked at him. What's your name? The child pressed closer to Martha. Samuel, Martha answered for him. This is Jonah, she said, touching the older boy's shoulder. And Ruth. Elias nodded. Samuel, the road is long. You can ride my shoulders if you want. The child stared at him suspiciously. Jonah said quickly, He can walk. Elias looked at the boy. Maybe he can, but he doesn't have to. That silenced him. After a moment, Samuel let Elias lift him. The boy was lighter than a sack of flour. too light. Elias felt anger rise in him, not loud anger, but the kind that settles deep and turns into something harder. They walked for hours through brown fields and pine-shadowed hills. No one spoke much. Ruth kept glancing at Elias's axe as if afraid it might be meant for them. Jonah walked behind his mother, carrying himself like a guard dog too young to bite, but willing to die trying. Martha moved with slow determination, never asking to rest, though Elias could see she needed to. Twice he stopped and pretended to adjust the bundle so the children could breathe. By the time they reached Black Pine Valley, the sun had dropped behind the western ridge, and the air smelled of frost. His cabin came into view beneath a line of dark pines. It was smaller than Martha expected, worse than the children feared, and exactly as poor as the town had laughed about. One wall leaned slightly. The roof sagged near the chimney. A pile of split logs stood under a torn canvas. The garden was a patch of stubborn soil surrounded by stones. The mule watched them from a crooked fence, unimpressed. Samuel whispered from Elias's shoulders, "Is this where we die?" Elias stopped. Martha closed her eyes for half a breath. Jonah looked away, ashamed of his little brother's words. Elias lowered Samuel gently to the ground and knelt so they were face to face. "No," he said. "This is where we try not to." Samuel studied him carefully, as if deciding whether poor men were allowed to tell the truth. Then he nodded. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke, cedar, and old loneliness. There was one bed, one narrow cot, one table, 2 chairs, a stove, 3 cracked cups, and not enough blankets. Elias felt the poverty of the place more sharply with 4 other people standing in it. Alone, he had been used to it. With children staring, every empty shelf looked like an accusation. "You take the bed," he said to Martha. "The children too. I'll sleep by the stove." Martha shook her head. "We can sleep on the floor." "You can," Elias said, "but you won't." Jonah frowned. "We don't need charity." Elias turned to him. "Good, because I don't have any. What I have is a bed, and your mother looks ready to fall through the floor. Let her lie down." The boy's face reddened, but Martha touched his arm. "Jonah." One word. He stepped back. Elias found cornmeal, a heel of bread, and 3 potatoes. Not enough for 5. He sliced the potatoes thin, stirred them into a pot with water, cornmeal, salt, and the last scrap of dried onion, then set it to boil. The children watched the pot as though it contained treasure. When the food was ready, Elias served Martha first, then the children. He took the smallest portion for himself. Martha noticed. Of course she noticed. "You worked today," she said. "So did you. You paid for us. That doesn't make me hungrier." She looked at him for a long moment, then broke her piece of bread in half and set part of it beside his bowl. Elias almost refused, but something in her expression warned him not to turn kindness into a battle. They ate in silence. Afterward, Ruth fell asleep sitting upright. Samuel curled beside her. Jonah fought sleep until his head dipped forward despite his pride. Martha carried the little ones to the bed, and Elias gave her his only good blanket. She touched the wool, then looked toward the roof where wind slipped through a crack near the beam. "This place won't hold heavy snow," she said. Elias gave a tired half-smile. "No, I plan to fix it." "With what?" He almost laughed. "Hope, mostly." Martha stepped closer to the wall, pressed her palm against the timber, then tilted her head as if listening. She moved to the corner post, then to the ceiling beam. Elias watched, puzzled. Most people looked at a poor man's cabin and saw only failure. Martha looked as if she were reading a map. "This wall has shifted because the lower sill rotted on the north side," she said. "The roof weight is pushing unevenly. If snow sits there, the beam will split." Elias stared at her. "You can tell that by touching it?" She seemed to realize she had said too much. Her face closed. "My husband worked timber." "And you learned from watching?" "Something like that." Elias knew a hidden door when he saw one. He did not push. "Can it be fixed?" Martha looked up again. "Yes." How? She hesitated. Not tonight. That night, Elias lay near the stove beneath his coat, listening to 4 strangers breathe in his cabin. The wind moved across the roof. The mule shifted outside. Somewhere far off, a wolf called from the ridge. He wondered what madness had taken hold of him in the square. He wondered how he would feed them. He wondered whether the town had been right. Then he heard a small sound and opened his eyes. Martha was awake, sitting near the window, holding a scrap of charcoal from the stove. In the dim moonlight, she was drawing on the back of the auction paper. Lines, angles, measurements. Not random marks, but plans. Elias stayed still. Her hand moved quickly, confidently, sketching the cabin roof, the wall braces, a support frame, then something larger beneath it, something that looked almost like a bridge. Her face in that moment was no longer the face of a woman sold in a town square. It was the face of someone who saw structures where others saw trees, solutions where others saw ruin, and possibilities where others saw death. Elias did not speak, but Martha suddenly stopped, sensing his eyes. She folded the paper. "I was only thinking," she said. "About the roof?" he asked. "About surviving," she replied. Outside, the first flakes of early snow began to fall. By morning, the valley would be white. By nightfall, the whole town would hear that Elias Harper's roof had not collapsed under the snow, because the widow he bought for 5 silver had rebuilt its bones before breakfast. And that would be only the first thing she did that no one could explain. Morning arrived beneath a sky of pale iron, and the valley lay covered in a thin blanket of fresh snow that glittered beneath the weak autumn sun. Elias woke before dawn, out of habit, expecting to find the fire dying and the cabin colder than the forest outside. Instead, the room held a surprising warmth. Someone had risen before him. Martha was already outside. He pulled on his boots and stepped into the frozen air, where he found her standing beside the cabin with a long pine branch in one hand. She wasn't staring at the roof like someone admiring it. She was measuring it. Her eyes traveled from one corner of the cabin to another, calculating distances with quiet precision. She placed the branch against the wall, marked it with charcoal, then broke it into equal lengths before laying the pieces carefully in the snow. Elias watched without interrupting. She noticed him only after several minutes. "The beam above the stove carries too much weight," she said matter-of-factly. "If another heavy snowfall comes before winter truly begins, it will crack." Elias folded his arms against the cold. "Can it be saved?" Martha nodded once. "Yes, but not by repairing what already exists. It has to be supported from underneath." "With what lumber?" Elias asked. "I barely have enough firewood." She glanced toward the forest. "The mountain has everything we need." Elias almost smiled. "The mountain has trees." "Exactly." She turned toward him. "Most people cut trees because they're tall. They should cut them because of how they grew." Elias frowned. "I don't follow." Martha walked toward a young pine standing near the edge of the clearing. She rested her hand against its trunk. "This one grew on level ground. Its fibers are straight, good for boards, but not for weight." She pointed farther uphill toward several twisted pines clinging to the rocky slope. "Those grew fighting the wind for years. Their grain twists naturally. They're stronger under pressure." Elias blinked. He had chopped wood since childhood. He had never once thought about where a tree grew changing its strength. Martha continued. "Bring me 3 trees from the eastern slope. Not the tallest, the oldest. You'll know them because one side of the bark is darker." "How?" She looked at him for a second before answering. "Trust me." It was an odd request. It also happened to be the only plan either of them had. Elias harnessed the mule and spent most of the morning climbing the eastern ridge. When he found the trees Martha had described, his surprise deepened. Their bark was exactly as she had said, darker on one side where decades of winter storms had hardened the wood. Cutting them proved far more difficult than ordinary pine. The axe bounced twice before finally biting deep. By afternoon, he dragged the logs back to the cabin, exhausted and wondering whether the effort had been wasted. Martha wasted no time. She marked every log with charcoal, indicating exactly where each cut should be made. She even instructed him which end should face north once installed. Elias asked no questions now. Something told him she knew far more than she admitted. Jonah watched every movement from the doorway. The boy still distrusted Elias, but curiosity slowly overcame suspicion. "Mama," he asked quietly, "how do you know all this?" Martha smiled faintly without looking up. "Your father believed wood speaks." Jonah frowned. "Trees don't talk." "Not with words." She ran her fingers across the grain. "But they remember every storm they survive." The work continued until darkness. Together, Elias and Martha lifted a new support beneath the damaged beam, using nothing more than rope, wedges, carved braces, and carefully balanced leverage. It should not have worked as smoothly as it did, yet by sunset, the sagging roof stood perfectly level. Elias stepped back in disbelief. He had spent 2 years trying to solve that problem. Martha had solved it in a single day, using timber from the hillside. That night, the wind rose violently. Snow began falling harder than before. The old cabin groaned beneath the weight. Elias barely slept, expecting to hear the familiar cracking sound that always accompanied the first major storm. It never came. Instead, the cabin remained perfectly still while neighboring trees bent beneath the gale. At dawn, Elias opened the door and found nearly a foot of snow covering the clearing. The roof had not shifted even an inch. Martha simply nodded once, as though the outcome had never been in doubt. 3 days later, Elias rode into town with firewood to trade for flour. The moment he entered the square, laughter followed him again. "Still alive?" one merchant called. "Barely," another answered before Elias could speak. The tavern keeper waved him over. "Your family still breathing?" Elias nodded. "All 5 of us." Groans rose from the card table. Several gamblers cursed under their breath. One old rancher slapped 3 silver coins onto the table. "I told you Harper would last at least a week." More laughter followed. Someone asked, "How's that roof of yours? Collapse yet?" Elias answered honestly, "No." "Lucky." "Not luck," Elias hesitated. "Martha fixed it." The laughter stopped. "The widow?" "She rebuilt the supports." The blacksmith frowned. "Impossible." "She's never swung a framing hammer in her life," Elias shrugged. "Maybe not." The men dismissed the story as exaggeration. But later that afternoon, old Benjamin Cole happened to pass near Elias's cabin while checking his trap lines. Benjamin had built barns for 40 years. Few men understood timber better. Curious, he stopped to examine the repairs. His expression slowly changed from skepticism to complete silence. He climbed onto the roof, crawled beneath the beams, measured the angles with his walking stick, then climbed down again without speaking. When he returned to town that evening, people crowded around him inside the tavern. "Well?" someone asked. Benjamin took a long drink before answering. "Who repaired Harper's roof?" "The widow, apparently." Benjamin stared into his mug. "Then she's the finest timber mind I've ever seen." The room burst into laughter. Benjamin did not. "I'm serious." Silence slowly returned. "The support system she built shouldn't exist. It distributes the snow load across 4 pressure points instead of 1. Blank stares met him. Benjamin sighed. "Put simply," he looked around the room, "that cabin should stand another 30 years. The laughter disappeared entirely. Across the room, wealthy landowner Horace Whitmore quietly listened without joining the conversation. Unlike the others, Horace never laughed at useful information. He owned nearly half the valley: sawmills, storehouses, logging roads, bridges. He had become rich by recognizing value before everyone else noticed it. When Benjamin finished describing the repairs, Horace asked only one question. "Who taught her?" Benjamin shook his head. "No idea." Horace looked out the tavern window toward the distant mountains where Elias's cabin stood hidden among the pines. "Find out," he said softly to one of his men, "because people don't accidentally learn to build like that." Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Martha discovered something that changed everything. While clearing snow beside the foundation, she noticed water flowing beneath the frozen ground instead of away from it. She knelt, brushed aside the snow, and stared at the slope for nearly 10 minutes. Elias eventually walked over. "What's wrong?" Martha looked toward the valley below. Nothing. Then she pointed toward a narrow gorge less than half a mile away, where a stream disappeared between two cliffs. "Tell me," she said quietly, "has anyone ever tried to build a bridge there?" Elias laughed. "Everyone has." "And?" "Every bridge washed away within 2 years." Martha remained silent. "Why?" Elias asked. She stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the gorge. "Because they've all been building the wrong bridge." Elias followed her gaze, seeing only rushing water, steep cliffs, and snow-covered rocks. Martha, however, wasn't looking at the stream. She was already seeing something that did not yet exist, something no one else in the valley had ever imagined. And miles away in his warm brick mansion, Horace Whitmore finished reading an old newspaper clipping about Thomas Rowan, Martha's late husband. His eyes narrowed as he reached the final line. It wasn't Thomas's name that caught his attention. It was the small note beneath it. Bridge construction supervised by his wife. Horace slowly folded the paper, leaned back in his chair, and whispered to himself, "So that's who she is." The following morning, Martha walked to the narrow gorge before the sun had climbed over the eastern ridge. Frost covered every stone, and the stream below roared louder than it looked, its current twisting through the canyon with enough force to drag entire tree trunks downstream every spring. Elias followed several steps behind, carrying an axe across his shoulder, though he had no idea why she wanted to see the place. Every person born in Black Pine Valley knew the gorge. It divided the valley into 2 worlds. On one side stood the farms, the church, the mill, and the town itself. On the other side stretched thousands of acres of untouched forest, filled with the straightest pine in the region. The timber there was worth a fortune, but reaching it meant riding nearly 2 days around the mountain, because every bridge anyone had ever built across the gorge had eventually been destroyed by floods. Generations of men had accepted that fact. Nature had won. Martha stood at the cliff's edge without speaking. Her eyes followed the movement of the water, not the surface itself, but the strange circular currents beneath it. She crouched, picked up a handful of gravel, and dropped the stones one after another into different parts of the stream. Elias watched, puzzled. "What are you looking for?" he finally asked. "The river isn't the problem," she answered quietly. "Everyone believes it is." She tossed another pebble into the current and watched where it disappeared. "The cliffs are." Elias frowned. "The cliffs don't move." "Exactly," she smiled faintly. "And that's why everyone keeps making the same mistake." She picked up a fallen branch and began drawing in the damp soil. 2 cliffs, the river below. Then, instead of sketching a bridge resting on posts driven into the streambed like every other bridge Elias had ever seen, she drew 2 enormous wooden arches anchored deep into the rock itself. "They all tried to fight the river," Martha said. "You don't fight water. You let it pass beneath you." Elias stared at the drawing. "I've never seen a bridge built like that. Neither has anyone in this valley. Would it work?" Martha looked toward the gorge once more. "If it's built correctly, the river could flood every spring for 100 years without touching it." Elias let out a slow breath. "You're serious?" "Very." He looked again at the cliffs. Building something like that would require hundreds of trees, thousands of hours of labor, ropes, iron fittings, skilled hands, and money neither of them could even imagine. "No one would believe us," he muttered. Martha erased part of the drawing with her boot. "Not yet." They returned to the cabin before noon. Jonah had repaired one of the broken chicken pens while Ruth gathered kindling with Samuel. Elias smiled quietly. For the first time in years, the lonely clearing around his cabin sounded alive. Laughter drifted between the trees. The children were beginning to feel safe. That afternoon, an unexpected visitor rode into the clearing. It was Benjamin Cole, the old carpenter who had inspected the roof several days earlier. He climbed slowly from his horse and removed his hat. "Mind if I take another look around?" Elias shrugged. "You're welcome to." Benjamin spent nearly an hour examining every repair Martha had made. He asked no foolish questions. Instead, he asked about load angles, brace placement, moisture, grain direction, and compression. Martha answered each one calmly. The old carpenter listened more than he spoke. Finally, he stepped back, folded his arms, and laughed softly to himself. "I've been building for 42 years, he said. "Today I realized I've only understood half of what wood can do." Martha lowered her eyes. "You're too kind." Benjamin shook his head. "No, whoever taught you wasn't ordinary." Silence lingered between them. Finally, Martha spoke. "My father designed bridges." Benjamin's eyebrows lifted. "Engineers from the capital used to visit him." She smiled sadly. "I learned by watching." Benjamin looked at her for a long time. "Then your father was a genius." Martha whispered, "Yes." "And you?" She looked toward the forest. "I was only his daughter." Benjamin almost laughed. "No." He pointed toward the repaired cabin. "Your father may have taught you." Then he pointed at the beams. "But this," his voice softened, "this is your work." Before leaving, Benjamin handed Elias a small leather pouch. Inside lay 12 silver coins. Elias stared at him in confusion. "I can't accept this." "You're not," Benjamin smiled. "I hired you." "For what?" "Come repair my barn tomorrow." Elias blinked. "You could do that yourself." "Probably." Benjamin mounted his horse again. "But I'd rather have the woman who fixed your roof tell me how to keep mine standing another 30 years. Word spread through the valley within days. Benjamin Cole had trusted the widow. Then another farmer came asking for advice about a collapsing granary. Then another whose smokehouse leaned dangerously after years of settling. Martha never demanded payment. She simply explained what needed to be done. Sometimes Elias carried out the work. Sometimes the owners did it themselves after listening to her instructions. Every repair succeeded. Every building stood stronger afterward than before. People who had laughed in the town square now found excuses to ride past Elias's cabin. Some came out of curiosity. Others came hoping the rumors were true. Meanwhile, Horace Whitmore's curiosity had turned into obsession. Reports arrived almost daily. She repaired Cole's barn. She redesigned Miller's grain loft. She saved the Thompson smokehouse. Horace listened quietly before dismissing each messenger. Finally, he ordered his foreman, Victor Shaw, to visit the cabin personally. "Find out exactly what she knows," Horace said. "And if necessary," he paused before smiling thinly, "offer her employment." Victor arrived 3 days later, riding a tall black horse that looked almost too fine for the rough mountain road. He wore polished boots and a heavy wool coat lined with fur. Everything about him announced wealth before he spoke a single word. Elias was splitting firewood when Victor rode into the clearing. "Elias Harper?" "That's me." Victor glanced toward Martha, who was helping Ruth wash clothes beside the creek. "I'm looking for the widow." Elias rested the axe against the chopping block. "Why?" Victor smiled politely. "Mr. Whitmore has heard remarkable things about her talents." Martha approached quietly. "I'm Martha Rowan." Victor tipped his hat. "Mr. Whitmore would like to offer you a position managing structural work on his mills and bridges." Elias looked surprised. Whitmore employed dozens of experienced builders. Offering work to Martha made little sense. Victor continued. "The salary is generous. Your family would move into one of Mr. Whitmore's houses near town. Your children would attend school. Food, clothing, firewood, all provided." It was more than Elias had earned in 5 years. Martha listened without interrupting. "Well?" Victor asked. Martha smiled politely. "No." Victor blinked. "Perhaps you misunderstood." "I understood perfectly. Most families would consider this a blessing." Martha's expression remained calm. "Then I hope they receive it." Victor's smile slowly disappeared. "You're refusing?" "Yes." "May I ask why?" Martha looked toward the distant gorge, barely visible between the trees. "Because your employer doesn't want me to build." Victor frowned. "Then what does he want?" Martha met his eyes. "He wants me to make him richer." Victor said nothing. After a long silence, he nodded once, climbed back onto his horse, and rode away. Elias watched him disappear down the trail. "That was a lot of money," he said quietly. Martha nodded. "I know. We could have used it." "Yes." Elias hesitated. "Then why?" Martha looked toward the children playing outside the cabin. Samuel had convinced Ruth to help him build a tiny bridge across a muddy puddle using sticks and stones. Jonah stood nearby, pretending not to care, while secretly helping when they weren't looking. Martha smiled. Because some bridges shouldn't belong to one man. That evening, Victor reported everything to Horace Whitmore. Horace listened without interruption. "She refused?" "Immediately." Horace walked slowly toward the large map hanging on his office wall. His finger traced the line of the gorge separating the eastern forest from the valley. Millions of feet of valuable timber stood trapped beyond those cliffs. For 20 years, every attempt to reach it cheaply had failed. If Martha truly knew how to build a permanent bridge— Horace's eyes narrowed. "Then she'll build it eventually." Victor looked confused. "She said no." Horace smiled. "Not for me." He tapped the map. "But people like her always dream too big." "Meaning?" Horace turned toward the window overlooking the town. "Meaning she'll eventually try to build something that helps everyone." His smile faded into something colder. "And when she does," he folded his hands behind his back, "I'll make certain it belongs to me." Hundreds of yards away, beneath the stars, Martha sat outside the cabin with a piece of charcoal and another sheet of rough paper spread across her knees. Elias quietly placed another log onto the fire before sitting beside her. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, he glanced down at the drawing. Unlike the rough sketch from before, this one was astonishingly detailed. Every beam, every joint, every support had exact measurements. It wasn't merely a bridge anymore. It was a masterpiece waiting to exist. Elias stared at the impossible design stretching across the page. If someone actually built this— Martha looked toward the dark outline of the gorge beyond the trees. Her answer came almost as a whisper. It would change this valley forever. For the next several weeks, life settled into a rhythm unlike anything Elias had ever known. Before sunrise, he disappeared into the forest with his mule to cut timber or trap game, while Martha remained at the cabin with the children, tending the garden, repairing tools, teaching Jonah how to measure lumber, showing Ruth how to read numbers by counting wooden pegs instead of writing them on paper, and letting little Samuel follow her everywhere, carrying pieces of charcoal as though he were her tiny assistant. Every evening, after supper, she returned to the rough bridge plans spread across the table, adjusting another angle, another support, another measurement that only she seemed capable of seeing. Elias never interrupted. He had stopped asking whether the bridge could really be built. The better question had become whether anyone besides Martha possessed the courage to try. As winter crept closer, more people arrived at the cabin seeking help. A farmer wanted advice after his grain storage began sinking into soft earth. Martha solved it by showing him how to spread the weight across stone footings instead of deeper posts. Another family feared their chimney would collapse before spring. She redesigned the base in less than an hour, using broken field stones everyone else had considered worthless. A widow whose barn doors froze shut every morning left with a simple wooden hinge Martha carved from oak that continued opening even after the coldest nights. None of the solutions seemed complicated once she explained them, yet no one else had imagined them before. Soon, people stopped referring to her as the widow Elias bought. They began calling her the woman who understands wood. Benjamin Cole smiled every time he heard it. Horace Whitmore did not. Sitting inside his warm office overlooking the valley, he listened as another foreman delivered another report. 3 more farmers visited Harper's cabin this week. Horace tapped his fingers slowly against the arm of his chair. Did they pay? Some brought eggs, others flour. One repaired Harper's fence in exchange. Horace frowned. So she's building loyalty. Victor Shaw shook his head. I don't think she's trying to. Horace gave a cold smile. That doesn't matter. Influence doesn't ask permission before it grows. He rose from his chair and walked toward the large window. Beyond the rooftops of the town lay the distant mountains where the eastern forests waited beyond the gorge. Every season he lost thousands of silver because hauling timber around the mountain consumed weeks of travel. A permanent bridge would double his fortune, perhaps triple it. He had already offered Martha wealth. She had refused. That meant another approach would be necessary. A few days later, just after sunrise, 2 elegant wagons climbed the narrow trail leading to Elias's cabin. They carried bolts of fine cloth, sacks of flour, smoked meat, polished furniture, blankets, tools, children's toys, and enough supplies to keep 5 people comfortable through the winter. Elias stepped outside, confused, as Victor climbed down from the lead wagon. A gift, Victor announced. Elias looked from the wagons to the expensive supplies. From Whitmore? Victor smiled. Mr. Whitmore admires generosity. Martha emerged quietly from the cabin, wiping flour from her hands. Victor bowed his head slightly. No conditions, no contracts, simply a token of respect. Martha walked slowly toward the wagons, examining the supplies one by one. Ruth's eyes widened at the sight of a beautiful wool blanket dyed deep blue. Samuel stared at a carved wooden horse unlike any toy he had ever seen. Jonah looked toward Elias, uncertain whether to feel hopeful or suspicious. Martha finally stopped beside Victor. Please thank Mr. Whitmore. Victor smiled. Then you'll accept? Martha looked at the children. Then she looked back at the wagons. No. Victor's smile froze. Martha pointed toward the supplies. Take them to the widow living near Miller Creek. Victor frowned. What? Her roof burned last month. She pointed toward another wagon. The blankets can go to the Hensley family. Their youngest daughter has been sick since autumn. She continued assigning every sack, every crate, every tool, every piece of furniture to families poorer than her own, until nothing remained for the cabin. Victor stared in disbelief. You own almost nothing. Martha nodded. I know. Your children need these things. So do theirs. Elias watched the exchange without speaking. For the first time, he understood why she had never seemed broken despite everything she had lost. She simply refused to measure wealth the way other people did. Victor climbed back onto his wagon without another word. That evening, when he reported everything to Horace, the wealthy landowner remained silent for nearly a full minute. Then he laughed. Not with amusement, with frustration. She's impossible. Victor nodded carefully. She's dangerous. Horace's eyes narrowed. Explain. People already respected her skill. Victor folded his hands behind his back. Now they'll respect her character too. Horace turned toward the fire. That's much harder to buy. While Horace searched for another strategy, something unexpected happened in the valley. Heavy snow fell for 3 straight days. By the fourth morning, nearly every road disappeared beneath deep drifts. Several barns collapsed under the weight. One small bridge leading into the northern farms finally gave way after years of decay, cutting 6 families off from the rest of the valley. The town council gathered in panic. Without the bridge, wagons carrying food and firewood could not reach the isolated farms. Benjamin Cole examined the damage first. He shook his head. "We won't rebuild this before spring." "Then what?" someone asked. "We wait." A frightened farmer stood. "My wife is due to have a baby within weeks." Another added, "We're nearly out of flour." Voices filled the meeting hall. Fear spread quickly. Finally, someone spoke the name no one had expected to hear inside the council chamber. "Ask Martha Rowan." Silence followed. The mayor looked around the room. "The widow?" Benjamin answered calmly. "She's solved harder problems already." Within an hour, Elias and Martha stood beside the ruined bridge, surrounded by dozens of worried townspeople. Martha said nothing for several minutes. She studied the broken supports, the current below, the nearby trees, and the shape of the banks. Then she turned to Benjamin. "How many men can you gather before noon?" Benjamin answered immediately. 30. "Axes?" "Enough." "Rope?" "Some." She nodded once. "Good." Everyone waited. Martha pointed toward a stand of tall spruce growing less than 200 yards away. "We're not rebuilding the bridge." Confused murmurs spread through the crowd. "We're moving it." Nobody understood. Martha knelt and drew quickly in the snow with a stick. Instead of spanning the widest part of the stream where generations had always built, she marked a narrow bend farther upstream where the rock walls squeezed closer together. "The water is faster here," one farmer objected. Martha nodded. "Yes." "Then why build there?" She smiled faintly. "Because speed isn't the enemy." She tapped the cliffs. "Distance is." Benjamin's eyes slowly widened. He understood before anyone else. "We'll need half the lumber." Martha nodded again. "And half the time." Men who had doubted her only minutes earlier suddenly rushed to gather tools. Elias watched in amazement as Martha calmly divided the workers into teams. One group cut trees, another stripped branches, another carved joints, another prepared anchor stones. She never raised her voice. She simply gave instructions with quiet certainty, and somehow 30 stubborn mountain men obeyed without argument. Work continued through the freezing afternoon. By sunset, a rough but sturdy temporary bridge stretched across the narrow crossing. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't permanent, but wagons could cross safely before nightfall. The first wagon rolled across while the entire valley watched in silence. The bridge didn't move. The second wagon crossed, then the third. Cheers erupted along the riverbank. Some people laughed, others cried openly. The isolated families would not starve after all. As darkness settled over the valley, the mayor stepped toward Martha. "How can we repay you?" Martha brushed snow from her gloves. "Teach someone else." The mayor looked puzzled. "What?" Knowledge shouldn't belong to one person. She glanced toward Jonah, who had spent the entire day helping Benjamin measure beams. "Otherwise, it dies." The mayor slowly nodded. Across the crowd, Horace Whitmore stood watching from beneath the shadow of his carriage, unseen by most of the workers. His face remained expressionless as the wagons crossed the bridge one after another. But inside, his thoughts raced. The entire valley had witnessed what Martha could do. By tomorrow morning, every farmer within 50 miles would know her name. And if the people ever chose to build the great bridge across the gorge, there would only be one person they trusted to lead it. Horace quietly climbed back into his carriage. As the horses turned toward town, he spoke only one sentence to Victor. "If I can't hire her..." He looked once more toward the temporary bridge glowing beneath lantern light. "Then I'll make sure she never gets the chance to build the one she truly wants." The celebration lasted long after darkness settled over the valley, but Martha and Elias slipped away before anyone noticed. They walked home beneath a sky filled with bright winter stars, while the children laughed ahead of them, chasing one another through the fresh snow. Samuel insisted on carrying the small lantern, despite it being nearly as large as his head. Ruth kept telling him he was walking too slowly, and Jonah, pretending to be far too old for games, secretly made sure neither of them wandered too close to the frozen creek. Elias watched them in silence. Only a few months earlier, those same children had stood on an auction platform waiting to be sold to strangers. Now their laughter echoed through the forest. He had almost forgotten what happiness sounded like. Martha noticed him smiling. "What is it?" she asked softly. Elias shook his head. "Nothing." She looked at him knowingly. "That's not true." He hesitated before answering. "The cabin doesn't feel empty anymore." Martha followed his gaze toward the children. "No." Her voice became almost a whisper. "It doesn't." Neither of them realized someone else was watching from the darkness beyond the trees. Victor Shaw remained hidden on horseback until the family disappeared into the cabin. Only then did he turn back toward town with troubling news for Horace Whitmore. "The people love her now," he reported later that night. Horace remained seated beside the fire, staring into the flames without speaking. "Not just because she's clever," Victor continued, "because she never asks for anything in return." Horace nodded slowly. "That's exactly why she's becoming dangerous." He poured himself another glass of whiskey. "People can be bribed away from a greedy man." He took a slow sip. "They rarely abandon an honest one." Victor waited. Horace finally spoke again. "If admiration cannot be bought," he set the glass down, "it can be destroyed." 3 mornings later, trouble arrived. Elias had just finished feeding the mule when 6 mounted deputies rode into the clearing. Their leader unfolded a document bearing the county seal. "Elias Harper?" "Yes." "By order of the county magistrate, this property is under investigation." Elias frowned. "For what?" The deputy handed him the paper. "Fraud concerning transferred debt obligations." Martha stepped forward. "What fraud?" "According to this filing, the widow Martha Rowan concealed professional qualifications at the time of auction, reducing her assessed value and causing financial loss to the county." Elias stared in disbelief. "Assessed value?" The deputy nodded without emotion. "The claim states she should have been sold as a licensed bridge designer rather than an unskilled laborer." Jonah clenched his fists. "You sold my mother once. Now you're saying she was too valuable?" The deputy ignored the question. "Until the investigation concludes, ownership of this property is suspended." Elias felt anger rise inside him for the first time in years. "Ownership? County law. She's not livestock." The deputy looked uncomfortable but continued reading. "Should the court determine fraud occurred, the original transfer may be declared invalid." Silence fell across the clearing. Samuel looked up at Martha in confusion. "Does that mean we have to leave again?" Martha knelt beside him. "No." Her voice remained calm despite everything. "It means some people have forgotten the difference between justice and paperwork." The deputies searched the cabin for nearly 2 hours, examining documents, questioning neighbors, and writing endless notes. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Before leaving, the lead deputy quietly approached Elias. "Between you and me," he murmured, "this didn't start at the courthouse." Elias already knew the answer. "Whitmore." The deputy said nothing, but his silence confirmed everything. That afternoon, the story spread through the valley faster than the winter wind. Farmers abandoned work to discuss the investigation. Mothers whispered outside the church. Even children argued over whether someone could truly be sold twice. Benjamin Cole arrived at the cabin before sunset, carrying a folded newspaper from the county seat. Across the front page, a bold headline read, Famed widow's legal status questioned after remarkable engineering discoveries. Benjamin crumpled the paper in disgust. Whitmore owns half the newspaper. Elias took the article. Every paragraph painted Martha as a mysterious woman hiding secrets from the public. Some even hinted she had deceived the county intentionally. "This is a lie," Ruth whispered after reading part of it. Martha gently folded the newspaper and placed it on the table. Lies grow quickly when they're well fed. Benjamin leaned closer. "The hearing is in 6 days. Elias looked at him sharply. "Can they really undo the auction?" Benjamin hesitated. "The law is old." "Can they?" The old carpenter sighed. "If enough important people want it interpreted that way." No one spoke for several minutes. Finally, Jonas slammed his hand onto the table. "Then we'll fight them." Martha looked at her son with quiet pride. "Yes. We'll tell everyone what really happened." She smiled faintly. "No." Jonas stared at her. "Why not?" Martha rested a hand on his shoulder. "Because shouting at lies rarely defeats them." "Then what does?" She looked toward the window where the distant outline of the gorge could barely be seen beneath the snow. Truth. The days before the hearing became increasingly difficult. Strangers rode past the cabin, pretending to admire the scenery while secretly counting visitors. Reporters from nearby towns attempted to interview Martha, but she politely declined every request. Horace's newspapers printed fresh accusations almost daily. Some claimed her late husband had stolen bridge designs. Others suggested Martha exaggerated her knowledge. None offered proof. They didn't need proof. Doubt spread more easily than facts. Yet something unexpected happened. The valley began answering for her. The widow whose burned house had received Whitmore's rejected furniture appeared at the cabin carrying fresh bread. Then another family delivered eggs. Then another brought firewood. By week's end, dozens of people had quietly left gifts outside the door without asking for thanks. Benjamin smiled as he watched the growing pile. "Looks like the valley has chosen its side." Elias nodded. "I think it has." The morning of the hearing arrived bitterly cold. The courthouse overflowed long before proceedings began. Farmers filled every bench. Mill workers crowded the aisles. Even merchants who rarely agreed on anything stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the doors to open. Horace Whitmore entered confidently, wearing his finest coat. Behind him came 3 expensive lawyers carrying stacks of documents. Elias arrived with Martha and the children. Their clothing remained simple. They carried no lawyers. Only Benjamin walked beside them. Horace smiled politely as they passed. "Good morning, Mrs. Rowan." Martha inclined her head. "Mr. Whitmore, I hope there are no hard feelings." "About what?" "Business is business." Martha met his gaze without anger. "No." She smiled gently. "Business is business." Horace frowned slightly. Something about her calmness unsettled him. Inside the courtroom, the magistrate called the hearing to order. Whitmore's lead attorney stood first. For nearly an hour, he argued that Martha possessed rare engineering knowledge long before the auction, and therefore represented property of greater economic value than originally assessed. Since the county had unknowingly transferred valuable labor at a fraction of its worth, he claimed the sale should be voided. People in the gallery shifted uneasily. The argument sounded absurd. Yet beneath the old legal language hid a frightening possibility. Finally, the magistrate looked toward Martha. "Mrs. Rowan." He adjusted his spectacles. "Do you wish to respond?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Martha rose slowly. She carried no notes, no prepared speech. She simply looked around the crowded room until her eyes rested on the children sitting beside Elias. Then she spoke. "When my husband died," her voice was quiet enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. "No one came asking whether I possessed valuable knowledge. Absolute silence. When my children were hungry," she looked toward Horace, "no one wondered whether my hands could design bridges." Several people lowered their heads. "When I stood on that auction platform," She paused. I was worth exactly what compassion decided I was worth. Even Whitmore's lawyers stopped writing. Martha continued. If my knowledge has value today, she smiled sadly, it had the same value then. The magistrate nodded slowly. Martha's voice never rose. The only thing that has changed, she looked around the packed courtroom, is that people finally bothered to see it. Not a sound moved inside the hall. Then, from somewhere near the back, an old farmer stood up. She rebuilt my barn. Another rose beside him. She saved my grain store. A woman lifted her hand. She kept my children warm. Benjamin stood. She taught me things I've spent 40 years trying to understand. One by one, people throughout the courtroom rose to their feet. Nobody had planned it. Nobody had organized it. Yet within moments, nearly the entire gallery stood in silent support of the woman who had once been sold for 5 silver coins. Horace looked around in disbelief. He had expected a legal battle. Instead, he was watching something far more dangerous. The people themselves had become Martha's defense. The magistrate slowly removed his glasses and looked over the crowded room. Then his eyes settled on Horace Whitmore. It appears, he said quietly, that this court has learned something today which no statute ever anticipated. Horace felt the first hint of genuine uncertainty since this fight had begun. And before the judge could announce his decision, a breathless messenger burst through the courthouse doors, shouting words that froze every person in the room. "The old gorge!" he cried. "The western cliff has collapsed." For several heartbeats, nobody inside the courtroom moved. The messenger leaned against the doorway, struggling to catch his breath, his boots covered in fresh mud and melting snow. "The western cliff," he gasped again. "It gave way less than an hour ago. Half the road is gone." Panic rippled through the crowded courtroom. The Western Road was the only route connecting 3 mountain settlements to the rest of the valley during winter. If the collapse had blocked the canyon completely, hundreds of families could lose access to food before spring. The magistrate immediately stood. "How bad is it?" The messenger swallowed hard. "Worse than anyone imagined. The old trail disappeared with the cliff. 2 freight wagons barely escaped. Another one didn't." Martha's expression changed instantly. It wasn't fear, it was concentration. She turned toward Elias. "We need to go." Horace Whitmore stepped forward before anyone else could move. "I'll send my foreman." Martha shook her head. "By the time they arrive, the remaining rock will already be unstable." Horace frowned. "You haven't even seen it." "I don't need to." She picked up her coat. "If the western face failed after the early freeze, the eastern shelf is carrying stress it wasn't designed to hold." Several engineers employed by Whitmore exchanged confused glances. One of them muttered, "How could she possibly know that?" Martha was already walking toward the door. Elias followed without hesitation. Benjamin grabbed his tools. Jonah rushed after them before Martha stopped him. "Stay with Ruth and Samuel." Jonah protested immediately. "I can help." She placed both hands on his shoulders. "Today your job is protecting your brother and sister." The boy wanted to argue, but something in her eyes convinced him not to. "Come back," he whispered. Martha smiled. "I intend to." Within half an hour, nearly the entire town had gathered near the collapsed cliff. The sight silenced even the loudest voices. An enormous section of rock had broken away from the mountainside, taking the road with it. Below, shattered trees lay buried beneath tons of stone. Dust still drifted lazily through the freezing air. The remaining cliff looked cracked from top to bottom, as though another collapse might happen at any moment. Farmers, loggers, and deputies stood helplessly at a safe distance. Nobody dared approach. Martha walked straight toward the edge. "Stop!" one deputy shouted. "The ground isn't stable." She ignored him and knelt near a long crack running through the frozen earth. She pressed her hand against the stone, closed her eyes for a moment, then picked up a loose pebble and dropped it into the largest fracture. Everyone listened. Several seconds passed before they heard it strike somewhere far below. Martha slowly stood. "The hollow chamber underneath has opened." Benjamin looked alarmed. How large? Larger than the collapse itself. Elias saw the concern on her face. Can it be repaired? Martha didn't answer immediately. She studied the broken mountainside, then looked toward the gorge where her unfinished bridge existed only on paper. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, "The mountain has chosen." Benjamin frowned. Chosen what? Martha turned toward him. It just gave us the foundation. Confused murmurs spread through the crowd. Horace Whitmore stepped closer. What are you talking about? Martha pointed toward the exposed rock revealed by the collapse. Look carefully. Nobody understood until Benjamin climbed closer and brushed snow away from the newly exposed stone. His eyes widened. Solid granite, he breathed. Martha nodded. Not fractured shale. Benjamin looked back at her in disbelief. This could hold anything. Exactly. Horace stared between them. Explain. Martha drew several lines in the snow with a stick. For generations, everyone believed the bridge had to begin farther south because the cliffs looked stronger there. She pointed toward the exposed granite wall. They were wrong. She continued sketching. This collapse revealed the true anchor point. Benjamin slowly finished her thought. For the permanent bridge. Martha nodded once. The crowd fell silent. Even Horace understood what that meant. The greatest obstacle preventing construction had vanished in a single morning. The mountain itself had exposed stronger foundations than anyone knew existed. Horace's heartbeat quickened. If Martha built the bridge now, the entire eastern forest would become accessible. Trade would triple. New roads would follow. The valley would prosper beyond imagination. And whoever controlled that bridge would control the future. He looked toward Victor. Buy the land immediately. Victor hesitated. People are standing right here. Then buy it tonight. Unfortunately for Horace, he wasn't the only one thinking ahead. Benjamin quietly leaned toward the mayor. If Whitmore purchases that cliff before sunrise, every farmer in this valley will spend the next 100 years paying tolls. The mayor's face paled. Can he do that? Benjamin answered grimly. Legally, yes. Martha overheard every word. She looked toward the mayor. Call a public meeting. Tonight? Tonight. About what? Martha folded the rough sketch she had drawn in the snow. About building a bridge that belongs to everyone. By sunset, the church hall overflowed. Farmers sat beside merchants, loggers beside blacksmiths. Families filled every corner of the room until people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Elias remained near the back with the children, while Martha quietly stepped to the front. She carried no speech, only the worn bundle of drawings she had been perfecting night after night inside their tiny cabin. She unrolled the largest sheet across the table. Gasps spread through the hall. Nobody in Black Pine Valley had ever seen anything like it. The bridge wasn't merely functional, it was beautiful. Massive timber arches rose from solid granite anchors, carrying the roadway high above the river where spring floods could never reach it. Every beam, every joint, every support was carefully measured. Benjamin ran trembling fingers across the drawings. Good Lord, he whispered. This would outlive all of us. Martha looked around the room. Probably. An elderly farmer raised his hand. How much would it cost? Martha answered honestly. More than any one family can afford. The room grew quiet. More than Mr. Whitmore? Another man asked. Martha nodded. Yes. Disappointment spread quickly. Then she smiled. But less than all of us together. The room became silent again. She continued. One man cannot build this valley's future. She looked toward Elias, then toward the children sitting beside him. Neither can one wealthy family. Her eyes moved across every face in the hall. But an entire valley. She rested one hand gently on the drawings. Can. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Then an old widow walked slowly to the front, carrying a tiny cloth purse. She emptied its contents onto the table. 3 silver coins rolled across the wood. "It's all I have," she said. "Take it." A farmer stepped forward next. "I've got 2 oxen." Another raised his hand. "I'll give lumber. I'll forge every iron bolt. My sons will work without wages. My horses, my wagons, my quarry." One after another, people came forward until the table overflowed with promises, tools, contracts, savings, and hope. Elias watched quietly from the back of the hall. Months earlier, he had spent 5 silver coins to save one family. Now an entire valley was preparing to build something together because of that single decision. Martha turned toward him for just a moment. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Neither smiled. Neither needed to. They both understood the same truth. The bridge no longer belonged to a drawing. It belonged to the people. But standing outside the church beneath the darkness, Horace Whitmore listened through the open window as cheers echoed inside. His expression hardened. He climbed into his carriage and spoke only one sentence before the horses began moving. "If I can't stop the bridge," his voice became cold as winter itself, "I'll destroy the man standing beside the woman who's building it." Construction began before the first light touched the mountain peaks. It did not look like the projects wealthy men usually financed. There were no hired armies of laborers, no polished uniforms, no expensive machinery hauled in from distant cities. Instead, the valley itself came alive. Farmers arrived with wagons full of timber. Blacksmiths carried freshly forged iron straps, still warm from their furnaces. Stonecutters brought chisels that had belonged to their fathers. Women prepared meals large enough to feed hundreds of workers. Even children gathered loose branches, carried water, sharpened wooden pegs, and swept snow away from the worksite. Nobody asked how much they would earn. For the first time anyone could remember, they were building something that belonged to all of them. Elias stood on the granite ledge overlooking the gorge, hardly recognizing the place. Only weeks earlier, it had been silent except for the sound of rushing water. Now the cliffs echoed with axes striking timber, hammers driving iron, ropes creaking under impossible loads, and voices calling measurements from one side of the canyon to the other. Martha moved calmly through the chaos, as though she had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. She rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. Every instruction she gave was clear, precise, and somehow anticipated problems before they appeared. "Rotate that beam 12 degrees. Don't tighten that joint until the western arch settles. Those braces belong on the north side." At first, the experienced builders questioned her decisions. Then, one by one, they watched every prediction come true. A support she insisted on moving prevented a massive crack from forming. A beam everyone wanted to shorten fit perfectly once the temperature dropped and the wood contracted. A foundation others believed was level turned out to be nearly 2 inches off after she ordered it measured again. By the end of the second week, no one argued anymore. They simply listened. Benjamin Cole laughed one afternoon as he watched a dozen stubborn old carpenters waiting patiently for Martha's next instruction. "I've spent 40 years trying to convince those men they don't know everything." He shook his head with admiration. "You managed it in 14 days. Martha smiled without looking up from her drawings. Wood is honest. It doesn't care about pride. Meanwhile, Horace Whitmore's patience had finally disappeared. Every passing day strengthened the valley's faith in Martha, while weakening his own influence. Merchants who once depended entirely on his roads had begun donating supplies to the bridge instead. Farmers who rented land from him whispered openly about someday transporting their timber without paying his outrageous hauling fees. For the first time in 20 years, Horace saw the possibility of losing control. He refused to allow it. One rainy evening, he summoned Victor Shaw into his office and locked the door behind him. "How many men do we still have who owe us favors?" Victor hesitated. "Enough." Horace opened a drawer and removed a heavy leather pouch that landed on the desk with a dull metallic sound. Silver, a great deal of it. The bridge must never be finished. Victor stared at the pouch without touching it. "You're asking me to destroy it?" Horace looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm asking you to delay it." "How?" Horace's expression remained perfectly calm. "One support fails in the middle of the night." He folded his hands. "A stack of timber catches fire." Another pause. "Perhaps a rope breaks at the wrong moment." Victor understood immediately. "An accident." Horace nodded. "Exactly." Victor looked away. "People could die." Horace answered without emotion. "Only if they're careless." Victor left the office carrying the silver, but for the first time in years, his steps felt heavier than the money. 3 nights later, snow fell quietly across the valley. Most of the workers had returned home, leaving only a handful of volunteers guarding tools and supplies beside the unfinished bridge. Elias remained behind with Benjamin, checking the massive central arch before tomorrow's lift. Around midnight, while walking toward the lumber stacks, Elias noticed something strange. Fresh footprints. They weren't covered by snow yet. Someone had arrived only minutes earlier. He followed the tracks into the darkness until he saw movement between the trees. 2 men crouched beside a pile of dried pine branches soaked with lamp oil. One struck a flint. Elias shouted instinctively, "Stop!" The men froze for half a second before running into the forest. Elias chased them without thinking. Branches whipped across his face as he sprinted through the snow. He caught one man by the shoulder, sending both of them crashing downhill. They rolled through frozen leaves until Elias pinned him against a fallen log. The man's scarf slipped away. Elias recognized him immediately. It was one of Horace Whitmore's stable hands. The man's terrified eyes widened. "Please," he begged. "I needed the money." Before Elias could answer, another shadow emerged from behind a tree and struck him violently across the back of the head with a thick branch. The world exploded into darkness. When Elias opened his eyes again, pale morning light filtered through the pines. His head throbbed. Snow had settled across his coat. Benjamin's worried face appeared above him. "Easy," the old carpenter said. "Don't move too fast." Elias struggled upright. "The bridge." Benjamin smiled faintly. "Still standing." Elias looked around. Workers filled the clearing. The attempted fire had been extinguished before it spread. Martha knelt beside him, carefully wrapping a cloth around the cut on his forehead. Her hands trembled slightly. It was the first time Elias had ever seen them shake. "You scared me," she whispered. Elias managed a tired smile. "I scared myself." Benjamin held up a torn piece of cloth recovered from the fleeing attackers. Sewn into the corner was the unmistakable crest of Whitmore Timber Company. Murmurs spread rapidly among the workers. Anger followed. "He tried to burn it," someone shouted. "Arrest him!" another yelled. Several younger men reached for axes, ready to march into town immediately. Martha stood before them. "No." The crowd quieted. "He attacked Elias," Benjamin protested. Martha looked at the gathering workers. "If we answer violence with violence," she glanced toward the unfinished bridge, "then this becomes his bridge." Nobody spoke. Her voice remained calm. "We're not building revenge." She rested one hand against the enormous timber arch rising above them. "We're building something our children deserve." Slowly, the anger settled. Axes lowered. Men returned to work. News of the attack spread through the valley before noon. Horace expected fear to stop construction. Instead, something remarkable happened. Twice as many volunteers arrived the following morning. Farmers who had never lifted a framing hammer asked where they were needed. Young women stitched warm gloves for the workers. Elderly men who could no longer swing axes sharpened tools from sunrise until dark. The attempted sabotage had done the exact opposite of what Horace intended. It united the valley even more. Victor watched the growing crowds from a distant hill with growing unease. That evening, he returned the untouched pouch of silver to Horace's desk. "It's over," he said quietly. Horace looked at the money. "What do you mean?" Victor met his employer's eyes for perhaps the last time. You can't stop them anymore. Horace's jaw tightened. Everyone has a price. Victor slowly shook his head. Not this time. He removed the Whitmore Company badge from his coat and placed it beside the silver. I quit. Horace stared silently as Victor walked out of the office forever. 2 days later, the final and most dangerous stage of construction arrived. The enormous center arch had to be lifted into place. If even one rope failed, months of work would crash into the gorge below, likely killing dozens of people. Hundreds of valley residents gathered silently along both cliffs to watch. Martha stood in the middle of the worksite, studying every rope, every pulley, every anchor point one last time. Benjamin wiped sweat from his hands despite the freezing air. Elias walked over to her. Are you nervous? Martha looked up at the towering arch. Terrified. Elias blinked. Really? She smiled. Only fools aren't afraid before doing something that matters. He nodded slowly. Then, without another word, he reached out and took her hand. Just for a moment. Martha looked at their hands, then back at him. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Across the gorge, Jonah saw it happen. He smiled quietly to himself. Samuel tugged at his sleeve. What? Jonah grinned. Nothing. The signal horn echoed through the canyon. Every worker grabbed hold of the lifting ropes. Martha raised her arm. Steady? Hundreds of muscles tightened. The massive arch began rising inch by inch into the cold mountain air. Every eye followed it upward. Every heartbeat seemed to stop. And just as the great timber reached the halfway point, a sharp cracking sound echoed from somewhere deep inside the eastern cliff. Every head turned toward the eastern cliff. The sharp crack echoed through the gorge a second time, louder than before, followed by the unmistakable sound of stone shifting beneath thousands of tons of pressure. The workers holding the lifting ropes froze. Some instinctively stepped backward. Others looked toward Martha, waiting for the command that could determine whether they lived or died. She didn't panic. She closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, listening. Another rumble rolled beneath the mountain. Then she opened her eyes and shouted, "Release the south line! Tighten the western anchors! Everyone else, hold your position!" The orders came so quickly that nobody had time to question them. Benjamin repeated them at the top of his lungs. Men sprinted toward the western anchor posts while others released the heavy south ropes. The giant timber arch tilted dangerously, swinging several feet toward the river. Gasps erupted from the crowd. One of the main support cables snapped with a deafening crack, whipping through the air like an enormous serpent before disappearing into the gorge. Several workers lost their footing. Elias lunged forward, grabbing one man by the coat just before he slipped over the edge. At the same moment, another section of rock broke loose high above the eastern cliff and came crashing toward the bridge. Someone screamed. "Rockfall!" Dozens of people scattered instinctively. Martha did the opposite. She ran directly toward the center of the bridge. Benjamin shouted after her, but she never slowed. She reached the unfinished arch just as the first boulders slammed into the timber. The entire structure shuddered violently. Elias felt the vibration beneath his boots. Another impact like that would destroy months of work. Martha looked upward, calculating faster than anyone thought possible. Then she grabbed a nearby axe and chopped through one of the temporary balancing braces. Benjamin's eyes widened in horror. "What are you doing?" The enormous arch shifted suddenly, swinging several feet farther west. At first, everyone thought she had made a terrible mistake. Then the falling boulders struck the place where the arch had been only seconds earlier. Instead of smashing the main support, they crashed harmlessly through empty air before plunging into the river below. Silence swept across the gorge. Martha had seen the trajectory before the rocks even fell. The danger wasn't over. The shifted arch now hung at an impossible angle, supported by only 3 major lifting lines instead of 4. Any sudden movement could send the entire bridge crashing into the canyon. Martha looked toward the workers. "Listen carefully." Every face turned toward her. "When I count to 3, she took a deep breath. Everyone pulls together. Not one heartbeat early, not one heartbeat late. Hundreds of men and women tightened their grip on the ropes. Even children stood silently beside their parents. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath. Martha raised her hand. 1. Snow drifted quietly through the freezing air. 2. Elias looked at her. She looked back. In that single moment, they understood each other completely. Whatever happened next, neither regretted the day 5 silver coins had changed both of their lives forever. Martha smiled faintly. 3. Every worker pulled with every ounce of strength they possessed. The ropes groaned, timber creaked, iron bolts screamed under impossible strain. Slowly, almost unbelievably, the great arch rose the final few feet before settling perfectly into its stone cradle with a thunderous sound that echoed across the entire valley. Then, nothing. The bridge stood still. Benjamin stared upward with tears filling his eyes. "It held," he whispered. Someone cautiously stepped onto the finished span. Then another. Then a wagon rolled forward. Every wheel crossed safely. A horse followed. Then another wagon. The bridge never moved. Cheers exploded from both sides of the gorge. Men embraced one another openly. Women cried. Children raced across the bridge laughing as if they were the first explorers entering a new world. The impossible had become real. The valley finally had the crossing generations had dreamed about. The mayor slowly walked to the center of the bridge where Martha stood beside Elias. He removed his hat. Then, before thousands of witnesses, he spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Years ago," his voice trembled slightly, "this valley watched a widow and her 3 children sold for 5 silver coins because we believed they were a burden." Complete silence settled over the crowd. Today, he looked around at the bridge stretching proudly across the gorge. That same woman has given every child born in this valley a future we could never have built without her. No applause followed immediately. The words were too heavy. Then Benjamin stepped forward first. He removed his old carpenter's hat. One by one, every worker did the same. Farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, loggers, mothers, children. Hundreds of hats came off in silent respect. Martha lowered her eyes, overwhelmed for the first time since anyone had met her. Samuel suddenly ran across the bridge and threw his small arms around Elias's waist. "Dad!" he shouted without thinking. The word echoed louder inside Elias's heart than every hammer that had built the bridge. Samuel froze, realizing what he had said. I didn't mean..." Elias knelt and hugged him tightly. "You did." Tears filled the little boy's eyes. Ruth quietly slipped her hand into Elias's. Jonah stood awkwardly for several seconds before finally stepping forward. "If," he muttered, unable to meet Elias's eyes, "if it's all right." Elias smiled before the boy finished. "It is." Martha watched the 4 of them together, and tears she had held back for years finally escaped. Elias looked toward her. "Come here." She walked slowly across the bridge until she stood beside them. Without another word, Elias took her hand in front of the entire valley. No speeches, no grand declaration. Just 2 people who had survived enough winters to know that love was proven far more by actions than words. Months passed. The bridge transformed Black Pine Valley exactly as Martha had predicted. Trade flourished. New farms appeared beyond the eastern forests. Small businesses opened. Children attended school through every season because floods no longer trapped them for weeks at a time. Families who once struggled merely to survive began saving money for the future. The bridge was never named after a king, a politician, or a wealthy landowner. The town council voted unanimously to call it Hope Bridge, because they believed that was what had truly crossed the gorge first. As for Horace Whitmore, the court eventually uncovered enough evidence connecting him to the attempted sabotage that he lost much of his fortune paying fines and compensation. More painful than losing money was losing the trust of the valley. Wealth could be rebuilt. Respect could not. Years later, travelers passing through Black Pine Valley often ask the same question after crossing the Great Wooden Bridge. Who designed something this extraordinary? The older residents would smile and point toward a modest white farmhouse overlooking the gorge. There, they said, lived the woman who had once been considered worth less than a healthy horse, and the poor woodsman foolish enough to spend his last 5 silver coins on a widow with 3 children. Then the old storytellers would always laugh softly before adding the same final sentence. Turns out, it wasn't the man who bought the widow that day. They would glance toward the bridge stretching proudly across the valley. It was the widow who rebuilt an entire valley and gave the man who saved her a family worth more than all the silver in the world.